Hello, I'm Christopher Shore from the Center for Contemporary Printmaking, and we are going to talk about the tools and techniques for etching and engraving. So we have this incredible show here. Behind me are all these amazing Rembrandt prints. And then on the other side of the gallery, there's some unbelievable Durer engravings. He was one of the greatest engravers at the time. So etching and engraving came through the technology that's usually used for making jewelry and armor. That's kind of where it came from. Gold engravers were some of the most important people at the time. There were guild systems, and the gold engravers were not only some of the richest people, but some of the most talented. It's worth noting that gold engravers got paid in the amount of gold they removed from the piece of metal they were engraving. Now, working backwards, armor was one of the very first things that were engraved. It would have been the most wealthy and most important people actually had their own armor made for them. And by engraving designs on them, it showed how important they were, how special they were, but it also kind of represented their wealth, that they were wealthy enough to have these artisans to do this kind of crafting. Now, in order to make plates that later were used for printing, they didn't have the ability to roll out plates like we do. They would have had to take an ingot of metal and they would have had to pound it flat. Now, the original engravings were most likely done on steel. It was much later that people focused more on copper because this was, as I said, a lot of it had to do with armor. And obviously gold, but gold is a very soft metal, so it wouldn't really work very well for the printmaking part. Once they pounded the metal, they would have gotten a sheet that looked something like this, relatively thin, relatively even, and the initial scratching would be done with a burin. There are many different types of burins. There are fat burins, there are medium burins, and then there are very, very skinny burins. It's basically a squared off shaft of metal. It's been cut at a 45-degree angle so that you get basically like a diamond-shaped tip that you can then use to put your design into the plate. Carving into a surface is one of the oldest endeavors that humankind has embarked on, whether it was scratching into a cave wall, carving a piece of wood, drawing into the sand. As long as there have been humans, they have been scratching into things. But it was much, much later that they were able to devise a system for printing these scratches. Some of it had to do with the development of paper, which happened much later, as well as the development of ink and the need for actually wanting to make a print. I actually have a great picture of a studio, and you can see it was a very busy place. In the very back room, you can see some people are working on designs. You can see an apprentice here working on a plate. You can see the press, which we have a modern version of, as well as people inking and handling paper, which we will all get to. So some of the tools that they used, we don't really use that much anymore. They often, for engraving, would use a leather pad that was sort of like a pail-shaped. We don't usually use that anymore. What contemporary engravers are using is often a piece of cardboard that they can then tape their plate down to. Having it on a board allows us to move the plate as we're engraving into the metal. Now, except for artists that are doing engraving these days, the only other field besides jewelry is gunsmithing. They often will engrave designs into shotguns and various pistols and things, which is a long history. So once you have the metal plate down, you'll choose your burin. They're ergonomically designed to fit into the palm of your hand. Now, in order to engrave into these, you don't push the point through the metal, you actually turn the metal as you're doing your design. So You set the tip into the plate, you lower it down, and then as you move the plate around, you slowly start to remove a line of copper out of the sheet of metal. Now, when apprentices were trained for engraving, their final exam would be to make one perfect circle, which sounds relatively easy, but they would often train for about 8 to 10 years in order to execute one perfect circle. I am no expert, but I can definitely carve a circle into a piece of copper. Now, if any of the copper doesn't come off, there are tools called scrapers, which are sharp metal points, edges, that allow you to remove the burr from the plate. There are also burnishers that will allow you to smooth the metal back down if there's any unwanted ridges. So carving straight lines are relatively simple. The curved lines are what take a lot of trick. Now, the smaller the burin, the shallower it carves into the metal, giving you a much more delicate line. The other thing that engravings are most known for are the ability of the engraver to make the line swell and shrink as you're carving, so you get this beautiful undulated quality to the line, but they're very crisp and precise. So engraving is a very direct process. As I said, came right out of jewelry. Now, oftentimes, because it's simply line, the artist has to create often cross-hatching or some way of creating tonal values, because there's either a line or there's no line. So it's ink or no ink when we get to the printing. So in order to create variation, you have to put lines closer together or further apart to create tonal values. So that's the basic process of engraving. Now, for etching, etching was developed to kind of free the artist up so that they could design something in a much faster and more efficient way. Ironically, it also started with the decoration of armor. You can imagine a full suit of armor from head to toe would take weeks and weeks to engrave all the designs all up and down the armor. So they wanted to come up with something a little bit faster. So they developed a way of being able to cover a plate with something that was acid resistant and then introduce an etchant, some sort of acid or etching material that would then eat into the metal to create grooves. All of these processes we call intaglio because the process creates a furrow or a groove in the plate, and that's where the ink goes. Intaglio is the Italian word for sort of in the grooves. The same metal would be used, a metal plate, but this time instead of doing directly into the surface of the plate, it would be coated with an acid-resistant ground. Now, the bulk of the acid-resistant ground is made up of beeswax. This is just a dollop of beeswax. If it was warmed, you could then cover the plate with it. The only problem is pure beeswax is clear. So you would never be able to see the difference between where you scratched and where you didn't. So they started to introduce paint or pigment into it. So this is a hard ground that has the darkened pigment into it, so that when it's coated on the plate, what you end up with is a solid black acid-resistant surface. Now this is basically like a piece of paper. The design can now be scratched into it. There is a traditional twisted dry point. There's also, you can use a very, very fine point. Now the key is you don't need to actually scratch the metal itself. You just need to remove the ground that's on the surface of the plate. So you can very freely and fluidly draw into the ground with much less effort than it takes to engrave with the burin. So this frees the artist up to do much more creative mark making. Now, if you use a coarser point, your line will be bolder. So one of the things that artists did over the years is they developed a variety of tools so that they could draw a fatter line with a fatter tool and a finer line with a much finer point. Some artists would even use a scraper so that you could scrape a large area into the plate. It's not quite as easy to use as a regular dry point or etching needle. But anywhere where you open up the metal, it could then be etched into the plate. In terms of how they would etch the plate, initially steel was used, and steel could be etched with a variety of materials. One that was very common was to just take vinegar and add to it some sort of salt, some sort of very strong salt. And it would basically have this corrosive quality, so it would eat away into the steel, creating the grooves. Now, it was a bit inconsistent the way that it would sort of rust to make the lines. And it took many, many years for them to develop better ways of etching cleaner. So steel was used that way. It turns out that nitric acid had been around for many, many years. It is a wonderful corrosive, but it wasn't easily available to a lot of people. It wasn't until the late 1400s that the production of gunpowder actually ramped up in Germany and Italy, creating a byproduct that was one of the main components of making nitric acid. Now, nitric acid is a true acid. When the plate is submerged in the bath, what it actually does is it actually turns the metal into a gas. And that gas sort of will get trapped in the plate. And so often you'll see etchers using a feather to brush these bubbles off the plate so they don't clog the line as it's etching away. Now, once the design is etched into the plate, the ground can be taken off and it can be printed. Now, I have a great chart here that shows of the variety of times that you can etch the line in the etchant. So if you etch it for a very short period of time, you get a very fine, delicate line. If you etch it for longer, maybe 30 minutes, you'll get a much bolder line. And you can continue to etch the plate as long as the ground doesn't break down. So this is actually a 2-hour bite. And you can actually see that there are some spots where it's starting to break down the ground a little bit on the edges. But the length of time the plate is submerged in the etchant will determine the depth of the groove, how much ink it will hold, and how rich the line will print. Oftentimes, the artist would etch the plate once, meaning that they would have to draw delicate lines, medium lines, and bolder lines all at the same time, so that when they etched for the same amount of time, you would have some delicate lines and some bolder lines. It was much later that they created the technology to allow you to, what we call stop out, where you could etch the whole plate for 5 minutes, then stop some areas so they won't etch anymore, then submerge the plate again to create a deeper groove. And that was what was done on this plate in 5, 10, 20, 30, 45, 60, 90, and 2-hour increments, which gives you the variety of mark. So the technology really changed starting in about the late 1400s into the 1500s. By around the 1700s, printmaking was all over Europe, and that's when some of the greatest artists really started utilizing this technique. To show the rest of the process, I have some plates that have already been created. This is an engraving that I did many years ago, and this is an etching. Both of these are on a very small scale, only about 2 inches. but they are actually inked and printed in the same way. So let me prepare for printing. The inking of the plates is done basically the same, whether it's an engraving or an etching. We need to force the ink into the grooves, clean the surface, and run it through a press. Now I think it's worth taking a minute to talk about the press. This is an etching press. The design hasn't changed in hundreds of years. You have a top metal roller as well as a bottom roller, and the bed runs through between these two rollers. Now you can adjust the height of the top roller by adjusting these micrometers, which create a larger or a smaller space between the top roller and the bed. And we use felt blankets as the cushion. They also create the friction that allows the press to move freely through so that the pressure is pushing the paper into the grooves on the plate. Back in the day, they used to make their own ink, which was basically boiled linseed oil. Then it would be often burned to get rid of the impurities, and then pigment would be mixed into it, often some sort of carbon-based pigment, whether it was charred vines for a vine black or charred bones for a bone black. This is a French ink that works really, really great for these processes. We'll give it a little bit of a mixing to make it nice and soft. In an old-fashioned shop, they would have had an inker that would be dirty all day, and then they would have had someone to handle the paper that stayed clean. But I'm gonna have to do it all myself, so put on some gloves. Now, with a plastic card, we can then force the ink into the grooves on the plate. So we have to ink the entire plate, forcing the ink into all the nooks and crannies. You can see that's very simple and easy. One of the tools that they would have used back at this time, because they didn't have plastic, would have been a dauber, taking felt, tying it up. We actually use some tape. And with that, you can charge it up with some ink, and then you can force the ink into the grooves of the plate. So some people still use the dauber. It actually is a great way to sort of add and remove ink into your etching or engraving plate. But it does tend to be a little bit sloppier. I actually do prefer the card, but they didn't have the technologies that we have today. So once you get the plate fully inked, you can then remove some of the ink off the surface, as all we are concerned with is getting the ink into the grooves of the plate. Now we have a traditional wiping cloth called tarlatan. It's basically a stiffened cheesecloth. Would have been with some sort of sizing, maybe some sort of starch. And you make yourself a nice pad with it, fold it into itself, and then with a twisting motion, you're pulling the ink off the surface as well as forcing it into all the little nooks and crannies of the plate. Now these plates are very small. You can imagine a larger plate takes a lot more time and effort. Basically, this whole process is controlled cleaning. So we will clean the edges of the plate to try to keep it from being too sloppy. Sometimes we'll even wipe the back a little. These plates actually have been printed many times, so they're beveled so that it's very easy to wipe the edge of the plate off. Now we can do some polishing. So a small piece of newsprint, put it on the plate, and that will allow you to take off the excess ink and give the surface of the plate a nice shiny polish. As always, you don't want to press too hard, you don't want to push too lightly. The goal is to just make it look perfectly shiny and clean. Then we'll do a last little bit of wiping of the edge of this plate. This is the etching plate. You can always tell an etching because the lines are very consistent. And an engraving often will have some undulation and variety to it. So now we'll go back to the engraving plate. Got some clean paper here. Give it a nice flat polish. You can see that the surface gets nice and clean, and the ink is only in the grooves themselves that were either etched or engraved into the metal itself. Now, the paper that we're going to be using has been soaked so that it is damp. A dry paper will not get into the nooks and crannies to transfer the ink. So you need to dampen the paper. This is some very nice heavyweight paper. Not that dissimilar from what would have been used back in the old days, but much more consistent. We've got this nice piece of paper. It's soft and malleable so that it will form to the plate itself. So we'll pick these up and we'll place it down on the bed itself. And we can print these both at the same time. So the plate goes down, then the paper gets laid directly on top of the plates. The blankets go down, which act as the cushion. And then we run it through the press. Now we pull back the blankets and you can see the embossment where the paper has formed to the edge of the plate. And then we can reveal the print. An etching and an engraving. Yeah, so that's the basic process of etching and engraving. Now, if you ever want to see this actually happening in real life with actual artists, you can stop by the Center for Contemporary Printmaking, which is in Norwalk. We always joke that if our buddy Rembrandt was to walk into our shop even today, he would recognize the presses, the ink, the process, which hasn't really changed in 500-600 years. The difference is we're using some much more modern materials. But this is still a process that's used today by so many artists. Etchings and engravings are, one of the most sought after collectibles. They don't break down, they don't change over time, and we keep this art alive every day at the Center for Contemporary Printmaking.